Hey guys, today we have a really special video for you. So if you haven't already heard, we just released our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, and it's available wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And what better way to get you guys a little sneak peek of this incredible piece of art than to tell you one of the new stories that is in this book. Again, our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, is out right now wherever books are sold, so grab your copy today and follow along. And remember, your nightmares are waiting. Today's story is a good old-fashioned ghost story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has a big international flight planned, offer to buy them some snacks for the ride. But don't tell them your snacks are made entirely of Olestra and they're laced with laxatives. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of January 3rd, 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside of a local pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling totally annoyed. Now, normally, Thomas was a very upbeat and social person. He worked as a bricklayer, and basically every day after work, he would meet up with his friends at this pub. They would have some drinks and share stories and laugh. It would be a great time. But tonight, it was like everything annoyed Thomas, especially his friends. And as his friends droned on and on about the current drama going on in their town, Thomas finally had just had enough, and before he could stop himself, he stood up and slammed his beer mug down on the table, and right away Thomas knew he had overdone it, because immediately the pub went deadly silent, his friends all stopped, everybody's looking over at Thomas, and Thomas kind of muttered an apology, and then quickly grabbed his coat, he stood up, and just began walking like he was going to leave the pub. And the pub, again, is totally silent as he's walking, and then right as he's about to go out the door, his friends broke the tense silence in the pub, and they called out to him and said, "Hey, be careful out there." And Thomas just looked at his friends and kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, okay." And then he went outside. Thomas decided he would walk to his parents' house, which was not far away, and he would just sit by the fire and warm up for a bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked long hours and she often worked late, and when she worked late, Thomas would meet her at work and escort her back home. And that's what he was doing tonight. And so Thomas began walking down Black Lion Lane, and per usual, Thomas was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be this very friendly and bustling place. It was home to 45,000 people. It was located right on the outskirts of London, and lots of rich people like to go there to vacation. But recently, there had been a string of all these increasingly bizarre sightings, or attacks as people were calling them, in Hammersmith, and it had all the residents completely on edge to the point where people were not going outside. Now, Thomas thought it was totally ridiculous and thought people were completely overreacting, and so he had been doing his best to ignore the drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a corner, he nearly walked into two men that were walking the other direction. And when Thomas looked up to say he was sorry, one of the men screamed, "Get back!" And he was holding a club in his hand, and the other guy had a pistol in his waist, and he had his hand on the pistol grip. Thomas instinctively threw his hands up to show he was not a threat, at which point the man lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol, and one of them said to Thomas, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone. You should not be out here by yourself." And then before Thomas could say anything to them, they quickly walked past him and disappeared around the corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' house, and so he just kind of brushed off the incident and sped walked his way to his parents' house, kind of cursing the two men under his breath for their ridiculous warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house, and he walked up to the door, and normally his parents would keep the door unlocked, but when he tried it, it was locked, and then a second later, he heard his sister, Anne, inside the house coming to the door, and she called out through the door, "Who's there?" And Thomas is like, "It's me, Anne." But apparently that was not enough, and Anne called through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see you through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes, but he did what his sister asked. He stepped back and allowed her to see his whole person through the peephole, at which point he heard Anne fumbling with the lock. The door was unlocked. She opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door behind him. And her first question to Thomas was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house to avoid talking about this stupid topic,
But he realized that if he had gone back to his house, he likely would have gotten the same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. Because actually, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to, because the conversation was always going to be the same. It was going to be about these attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely convinced these attacks were being committed by a ghost. It all started about 2 months earlier when somebody spotted this mysterious figure lurking in the church cemetery. And Thomas thought really the hysteria should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after the sighting, it was figured out that the figure was actually just the butcher's son, and he was just dressing up in women's clothes, walking around in the cemetery to scare his friends. It was a prank. That was it. But the hysteria in town did not go away, because a week after this first weird sighting, there was another sighting in the cemetery. A local chimney sweep said he saw someone walking around in the cemetery who disappeared into the ground. Now, admittedly, a lot of people in Hammersmith, when they heard about this second sighting, they did kind of brush it off as just hysteria. But it was after this second sighting that the so-called attacks began in town. Late one night, a local resident was walking past the cemetery when something came up behind them and began choking them, and this resident was able to break free and run away to safety, but they turned and got a look at whatever was attacking them, and they described it as a phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was going past the cemetery when they got out for some reason, and then this creature with horns on its head came charging out and confronted the carriage driver, who apparently just turned and ran away, abandoning his 8 horses and 16 passengers. And so by late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings in town that basically everybody in Hammersmith, save for basically Thomas, was totally gripped by fear. And as terror kind of spread across town, Thomas had attempted to convince his wife and mother-in-law and his family that there was just no way this was a real ghost. This is people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. That's all this is. But Thomas's theory was really put into question when just a few days earlier, so a few days before he stormed out of the pub because he was so annoyed, somebody had died following one of these attacks. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 p.m. at night when something in the cemetery had rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her, and she barely had time to kind of turn and look, and she saw this kind of white flowing robe and a long pointed white hat, and that was all she remembered, because then she passed out. Then she woke up again and she was in somebody's house and her neighbors were all around her. They had found her passed out in the cemetery and carried her there. And so she comes to, and she's only able to choke out the story of what happened to her, the ghost attack, before she died. And so following this pregnant woman's death, the town of Hammersmith offered a reward for anybody who could capture or kill the ghost, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols. In fact, those 2 men that Thomas had turned the corner and bumped into, one guy had the club, the other guy had a gun, those guys were on their own patrol. And so the ghost and how to capture or kill it was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about, and it totally annoyed Thomas. It was what was being talked about at the pub by his friends when he got so mad he slammed the cup down and left the pub. To Thomas, the idea of capturing or killing a ghost made no sense, because a ghost is not real. Now, by this point, the butcher's son had come out and said, look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the first one. And he had an alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was not a person. To Thomas, he just felt like, okay, then there's somebody else in town that's just copying the butcher's son's prank, except obviously they've taken the pranks too far because they've gotten someone killed. At about 10 p.m., Thomas was inside of his parents' house, sitting by the fire, just kind of beginning to doze off. And as he sat there, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go out into the freezing cold night to go walk with his wife all the way back home. He'd much rather just stay here and sleep for the night and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she exploded on him and was like, are you kidding me? You're going to let your wife walk home alone in this environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there and protect your wife. Thomas was like, okay. And he got up, he grabbed his jacket, and he walked outside. As soon as Thomas was outside, he was feeling so annoyed at the current situation that he found himself thinking, you know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost, the person disguised as a ghost, I'm gonna bum rush them and beat them up. And it will prove to the entire town that there was never any ghost. It was just a person the whole time. And so Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and immediately he saw this big bush off to the side of the road on the sidewalk, and he could have sworn behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down, like they were trying to hide. And so Thomas stopped and he squinted in the direction of this bush, and then at some point he saw movement enough to confirm to him that that must be a person back there, and suddenly it clicked for Thomas. That must be the person